When I was trying to figure out what I wanted to say at this group, I was watching this new HBO show called The Young Pope. And it's pretty dreadful, but it's also addictive, if you know what I mean. But when he comes out on the loggia for the first time to speak to the people, he launches into this angry tirade, which begins, "What have you forgotten? You have forgotten God." And it's all downhill from there on. But anyway, why am I mentioning this? Because when I was thinking of this, I was thinking, well, that's a question I think we need to pose to my fellow economists. What have you forgotten? And I think the answer is you have forgotten, just like Jude Law says, you have forgotten God. Economists have forgotten what economics actually means. And, I think it's safe to talk about Aristotle in a group of Dominicans, so I'll do that. I mean, economics is basically, the word, oikos, nomos, is best translated as the ethical rules for managing the household, both public household and private household. Governments, households, businesses, everything. Ethical rules. Now, if you look at it from that perspective, it takes on a slightly different connotation, doesn't it? And of course, for Aristotle, economics has to be subsumed in his ethics. You all know what that means, about how we're oriented not towards making money, but for human flourishing, intrinsic, living in accord with what is intrinsically worthwhile for human beings, which is all about meaning, purpose, relationship, community contribution, and all these valuable things. And of course, in the context of the common good, because we are social and political animals. But if that's the case, how can modern economics work in that kind of sphere? And I think it actually, you can, in a very simplified form, translate the challenges of the modern economy into something that maybe in Aristotle would recognize, well, the concepts anyway, he wouldn't recognize the modern economy, obviously. I think there are three elements, and I'm kind of using, maybe anachronistic language here, but three elements. First is an economy that provides a seedbed for the cultivation of individual excellence and virtue, personal virtue. And what does that mean? That means the idea of a vocational notion of goods and services that meet real human needs and work that provides meaning, purpose, dignity, and fulfillment in the context of a responsible and prudent approach to production, consumption, and resource allocation. The second element, of course, if the first element is the personal, the second is the social. An economy oriented towards the cultivation of social virtue in the pursuit of the common good, which builds up social capital, as we all know, is those networks of norms and trust and relationships that that give rise to these reciprocal norms, and that will create institutions that are oriented towards the common good, especially economic and business institutions and corporations, and also civil society. The third element is what we call the material element, material prosperity, which of course in modern economists would recognize as GDP, economic growth, and all that stuff. That's still important, but obviously it's only one of the three components. And the problem arises is when you look at only that third part, which I believe most economists do. They're willing to look a little bit at social capital now because it's a little trendy. Personal excellence and virtue is another world. They don't know what that means. It's just... But Aristotle himself said, if you look at that third part alone, trying to create wealth for its own sake, not connected to the good, not connected to the common good, that's not economics. That's what he called crematistica. And that would actually undermine the good and the common good. And I believe that a lot of what I call it modern market ideology. Other people call it laissez-faire, neoliberalism. Those are all vague terms that mean different things to different people. So I'll just call it market ideology as opposed to, the market itself, which is perfectly fine. The ideology that surrounds it is not that fine. I won't go into the background of that because I don't have enough time, but it's rooted in utilitarianism with a dose of libertarianism thrown in, and all the assumptions that go with that. But this has, if you look at the financial sector today, I think that you could call that peak crematistica. It's become self-referential. It doesn't serve the interest of the real economy. It serves itself. And there are plenty of experiments which show that bankers are taught, are inculcated to believe that it's okay to cut corners, it's okay to cheat as long as you don't break the law, because you know what, the guy on the other side of the transaction should have been smart enough to know what I'm up to. If he didn't get it, it's his own problem. That's very much the mentality. And you can see that obviously completely undermines both individual virtue and social virtue. I'm just checking my time because I don't want to run out, because I tend to rattle on about this a lot. And then, of course, the real problem is, though, and I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to speak in theological terms like social imaginaries. I'll stick to much simpler language with this. If you tell people that what they're supposed to do in life is to, satisfy their self-interests, buy material goods with no acquisitive ceiling as much as you can, and you do that from competition on the market, well, that, psychologists tell us that leads to so much social stress and dysfunction, because it's saying that your goal in life is to maximize your material gain and satisfaction. And by the way, if you can't do that, you're a loser because you lost out in the market. That just creates all kinds. Psychologists say, that's a book written on this recently, the epidemic of stress and loneliness and mental disorder is directly related to all of this. And it's the same thing about the collapse in social trust, the worsening health and drug abuse and weak educational attainment, and people are just less happy. I think it's, and this goes back to the true meaning of happiness, which is as opposed to what you think you're going to be happy from just buying stuff. So I think there's a real issue there. If you disconnect the material side from the other two pillars, which are the personal virtue and the common good, you're opening the door to a whole world of problems. So what I really want to say is, given that backdrop, what are the main problems in the world today? And if you have that market mentality, that backdrop, where you lose track of what economics is all about, you are really poorly equipped to deal with the major problems in the world today. And I want to touch briefly on three of those problems. Employment, inequality, and the environment, which I think are the three big issues that we as a global economy face now. And I'm especially thinking of the US context. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, you have much more relevant issues of extreme poverty, which I will not touch on so much, but I will just say that's critically important to talk about. Employment I won't talk about so much, because it was actually talked about yesterday quite well, that work is actually not just about getting money to buy stuff. It's not about human capital. It's actually it's a reflection of dignity, a path to meaning and fulfillment. It's a path to virtue. And we have a real problem, because as we know, in the US, all the growth in employment since the early 90s has been in the non-traded sector. Health, education, restaurant, hotels, all that kind of stuff, service industry. And that has lower wages, lower protections, lower job security, lower job satisfaction. It's just a fact of life. Since the global financial crisis, this is a stunning figure to me, 94% of all growth in employment has been in what's called alternative work arrangements, temporary work, independent contractors, on-call work. And of course, we all know the big trends in globalization and technology. We talked about smart machines yesterday, where half of today's work could be replaced by machines. And one MIT study says that every extra robot can lead 7 workers to lose their jobs. Now, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether society can cope with that or not. We've had waves, last 200 years we've had waves of technological development, and workers have been displaced, and we managed to cope. We don't know. This is a new world. We don't know what's going to happen. But we do know that if people don't have satisfactory work, you get, again, social dysfunction. We have evidence, when I was at the IMF, they did work on this. Unemployment, prolonged unemployment, worsens health, causes people to die younger. It impedes the educational attainment of your children. And I think most scary right now is it depletes trust in institutions and leaves people more prone to populist and nationalist backlashes. So, this is a big, big issue that we need to think about right now. The second issue, which is related to that, is inequality, which, as we know, it's back in the US today, the level of inequality, whether you measure it by the Gini coefficient or whether you measure it by the income share of the top 1% or top 0.1%, whatever you want to measure it, it's back to where it was during the Gilded Age, during its peak in the 1920s. Now, some economists will say that's not bad, because inequality is just a reflection of, market gains and market losses, and it's all justified. But I think that's a very overly narrow view of things. Inequality today is driven pretty much by the same forces as it was back in the late 19th, early 20th century. Major technological improvement and globalization. Same things, and it's doing the same things. It's shifting resources from away from low-skilled workers and from labor towards capital. Now, as we know, Thomas Piketty said that inequality develops a momentum of its own, and he had this very mechanical idea that if the return on financial capital exceeds economic growth, which he says it always does, except in very rare periods, then inequality perpetuates, and it gets worse. Some people said that's very mechanical. I actually think the better analysis of global inequality is not from Thomas Piketty, it's from Branko Milanovic, who's also written a great book on inequality. By the way, it's only 200 pages as opposed to 800 pages. So if you want to read one book, I would recommend Branko's book. But he argued that, what tends to happen when inequality goes up, driven by things like technology and globalization, it self-reinforces, it gets a momentum because you get what he calls pro-rich policies. The wealthy capture the system, and you get tax cuts for the rich, curbs on the bargaining power of labor, greater tolerance for monopoly and rent-seeking, more financial deregulation. It happened in the late 1920s. It happened in our own period. And this goes back, so then again, this is not mechanical. This is a deliberate, policy change. And it gets back to Aristotle's real worry about why inequality was harmful. Inequality is problematic because you lose the sense of shared purpose necessary for the realization of the common good. The poor are too distracted or excluded or marginalized to embrace civic duty, while the rich care more about their wealth. This is the insight of Aristotle, and I really think that can explain a lot of what's going on today. And if you look at what's going on in the Latin American model, which has some of the highest inequality in the world, what you see is swings between oligarchic dominance and populist backlashes. And both sides of the pendulum, you get stuck in this, you get mired in this mud. So I just ask a provocative question. Has the US reached a terrifying regime shift? Now that inequality is now rapidly approaching Latin American levels. Or as Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, says, inequality means that capitalism feeds on its own children. What he meant by that is something that Aristotle would recognize. Inequality undermines both personal and social virtues. It leads to lower economic growth for a number of reasons, which I won't get into because I'm running out of time. But Milanovic had the scariest thing of all. He said, inequality, and he's the world expert, he's looked at inequality from the Roman Empire all the way to the present day. He says inequality doesn't fall on its own. It only comes down due to things like wars, revolutions, and social disruption. And the idea that World War I was a response to the inequality and the dysfunction that emerged beforehand is a very common argument. Everybody from Keynes to Lenin made that argument. But that's actually very, very scary for us right now in terms of what the future would portend in terms of social strife and division. So that's employment and inequality. I think the worst trend of all is the environment. Because in 1936, when Keynes wrote the general theory, he said the two main problems of the world today, this is Keynes, are the failure to provide full employment and the inequitable distribution of income and wealth. Employment and inequality, the same issues we're dealing with today, almost 100 years later, 80 years later. But what Keynes could not have foreseen, what did not foresee, was the environmental pressures which would emerge. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've gone through wave after wave of technological development powered by the burning of fossil fuels, so much so that our global economy today is 200 times bigger than it was on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. Most of that development, you might not realize, came after the Second World War, because that's when the convergence of the developing world started to really happen in earnest. What that means is we are pushing precariously up against what the scientists call the planetary boundaries. These are the boundaries that, demarcate a safe operating zone for us within the chemical, biological, and geological cycles of the Earth. If we go outside those boundaries, we're in unknown and dangerous territory. What are the boundaries? Climate change is the biggest one. But there's not just climate change. It's ocean acidification. The overuse of freshwater resources. You in California know exactly what that means. Land use changes, specifically deforestation and the destruction of the rainforests. The interference with the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles brought by overuse of fertilizers. Ozone depletion. Chemical pollution. Airborne pollution. If you're in Beijing, you know what that means. And a rapid loss of diversity from the collapse of ecosystems. These are the boundaries which demarcate what we call the Holocene, this 10,000-year period of amazing climatic stability which allowed the emergence of human civilization and human flourishing. We are on the verge of moving outside that period into a period called the Anthropocene, which we don't know what's going to happen. We do know, just looking at climate change alone, that we have warmed by 1 degree Celsius since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That might not sound like much, but it actually, over the past 10,000 years, that's really, really significant. Already at 1%, we are seeing what's happening in terms of the pressure on drought-prone regions. Newspapers don't report this for some reason, but the Syrian civil war was preceded by, from 26 to 2010, the worst drought in 1,000 years, possibly even since the dawn of agricultural civilization and the Fertile Crescent. Obviously, we don't have records going back that far, but some scientists say yes. And again, also, if you look at what's going on in Nigeria with Boko Haram and everything, you have Lake Chad has disappeared. The Sahara is moving southwards. The pastoralists are moving south, bumping into the farmers. Pastoralists are Muslims. The farmers are Christian. Boom. Right? Again, this is not on people's radars. This is only at 1%. The global community at Paris said we need to limit this to 2 degrees Celsius. If we keep on doing what we're doing, we're headed for 4 to 6 degrees by the end of the century, which is game over. We don't know what that's going to do, but it's a catastrophe in the making. Now, limiting the climate increase to 2 degrees Celsius, we know it can be done. We know what it costs. It only costs about 1% of global GDP a year. Not a small number, but it's manageable within the context of the global economy. In comparison, by the way, military spending costs about 2% of GDP a year, just to put it in context. The problem is the will to get it done. And I think this is a perfect example of putting crematistica over oikonomia, because you are undermining human flourishing. You're undermining the conditions for human flourishing, the personal and social virtues needed to build a proper ecological sensitivity and build the proper social and institutions, especially political and corporate, dedicated towards the common good. So we've run out of time, so I'll stop there. We have a lot of things. I mean, I think, I didn't mention Catholic social teaching once, but obviously from everything I said, it's completely coherent with Catholic social teaching. It's also completely coherent with the teachings of the other religions, by the way. We work, at the initiative I work on, we work on a kind of a multi-religious consensus based on this reciprocal relationship between unfolding of human dignity and advancing the common good, which is shared by all religious and ethical traditions across the world. But, where we are now with market ideology and its assumptions, we're in a bad place, and I think we need to think about change. Now, luckily, we can do that. I won't talk about it because I don't have time, but there is a great tradition called the civil economy, the civil market economy tradition. It's an Italian tradition. It's an alternative to the Anglo-Saxon tradition, but it's really based on the idea that the market itself can inculcate values like reciprocity and sociability. You can make a profit in the market and also give a social benefit to society. They're not mutually exclusive. It's not just the individual on one hand and the state on the other. There is this civil market economy zone where we can build the good and build the common good. Thank you.